Hey GRI 201, my name is Isabelle Kovalchek, and just to start off, I am a straight white female. Um, just to start somewhere, so I've learned a lot in this class. I've learned a lot, obviously, about key terms and foundational principles, different models pertaining to race, but I've also learned a lot about other people, definitely a lot about other races and other ethnicities. I've been able to sit down in a controlled environment with people who are different from me and be able to listen to their perspectives on things, hear about their experiences, and I think both types of learning are really important. By nature, I'm a relatively academically minded person, and so especially coming to something as abstract as identity or race, which isn't something that I've really been trained to think about that much, it was helpful to have these academic ideas or papers, things like that, to go back to look at it as a lens that I could apply to these matters of race and stuff. So yeah, that's all just been really helpful, and I've learned a lot in that sense. I guess I'll start with myself and my identity. So coming to this class, I did not have a strong sense of racial identity, and I still don't. I think that's one thing I learned in the class is that I don't have a strong sense of racial identity. Um, I've always been like just white. And I think that's something else that I've learned from this class is that you kind of have two types of white people, in my opinion. I mean, you have tons of subdivisions and everyone is an individual, but when you talk about white people talking about their racial identity or who they are, I feel like you kind of get two frames of reference. So you have white people who are really tied to their ethnic identities, their cultural backgrounds, and you ask them about their race or their identity, and they're very tied to the fact that they're German or Italian or Greek or anything else. And then you have white people who are just white, like me. Um, and that's something that kind of interests me. So for one thing, I wanted to dive into this because it's just difficult for me to think about in general. Like I'm not trained to think about it, and if anything, as a white person, I've probably been trained not to think about race very much. But that's kind of what I want to talk about in this video is I want to get into this idea of white people lacking identity, lacking racial identity, because we talked about this in class, right? So we didn't know what whiteness was. Like even after a day of conversation, we'd still come away and be like, what is whiteness? Um, First of all, I want to talk about whiteness from a scholarly standpoint because it's important to note that whiteness exists on different levels, and for one thing, from a scholarly perspective, whiteness is a location of structural advantage. It is a place of privilege because of the way that our institutions and our social systems are set up. Whiteness is privilege, whiteness is advantage in society. But at the same time, whiteness is viewed as default. It is kind of a place of invisibility, and that's something that Robin DiAngelo talks about in her paper on white fragility, and that was something that really stood out to me that I wanted to dive into, so I did. So for one thing, whiteness, just because of the way that our system is, the fact that our society is a white space, whiteness is viewed as default. It is this idea of this universal reference point, which definitely isn't real. But white people get to view themselves as just people. They get to view themselves as humans. White people don't have to exist from a racialized perspective. And that's something, whether they want it or not, that minorities don't get to do. White people just get to be people, whereas minorities, they are attached to their racial identity. And the more I think about that, it's something that I don't think is fair, that I get to have this freedom or this detachment from race that other people don't get to. And then just expanding on that, so with whiteness being seen as a default, we tend to look at default as being equilibrium, right? Default is at a certain homeostasis. And that's an interesting concept to me, and I think that there's so much that stems from that social viewpoint. In the paper White Fragility, looking at white fragility, like actual white fragility, and what sets off white people, white people are very uncomfortable talking about race. They're very uncomfortable in racialized settings. And when confronted with race, we see this display of white fragility in some interesting ways. White people will get angry or defensive, or they will disengage from a situation. Maybe they just mentally check out, or they actually want to physically remove themselves from the situation. And all of those defense mechanisms are ways of reestablishing equilibrium, and that makes sense going back to that default idea, because default tends to be equilibrium. There is a list in D'Angelo's paper talking about certain things that set off white fragility, certain white notions that once they're challenged, it results in these huge displays of white fragility. But one of those things on that list is individualism. So when white people have their notion of personal individualism challenged, it's something that they can't work with. And that's something, there's this whole long list, but that's something which stood out to me because I don't view myself from a racialized point of view, from a racial perspective. I get to see myself as an individual. And so there's a few things that I want to get into with that. So white people take two stances. I'm an individual. I'm not tied to race. Why do I have all of the burdens of whiteness put on me when I'm an individual, when I'm not racist, I didn't own slaves, whatever, right? Like, you have all white people that are really big on individualism. And at the same time, white people will throw out universalism and say, oh, like, we're all the same. Why do you have to make these differences, these, determinations about race? Like, we're all the same. We're all people. And you can't have both. And quite frankly, neither one works. So just to start with racial universalism, it's not a good thing. It's not good to declare that all people are the same, because that denies the importance of race, and that denies existing social power structures that are based on race, and that do deny minorities privilege and power and equity in society. As much as we're all humans, we're not the same. We are all coming to racial situations, coming to our everyday lives, carrying our individual perspectives, our individual identities. And I think this is something that really goes back to intersectionality, is that, no matter what, we are all individuals made up of everything that we are, every experience that we've had, all of our identities. And even when we have overlapping identities with other people, we're not going to view the same situation in the same way because of our other identities. And I think that's important, that we can't come to a certain situation and choose to only make one of our identities relevant in that particular context. It doesn't work like that. Okay, so yeah, rejecting racial universalism. At the same time that we need to see ourselves as individuals, it's also important to note that we're not just individuals. This is difficult for me. It's difficult because I want to be precisely who and what I am. I don't want to exist in the context of a greater definition pertaining to an aspect of myself, and in this case pertaining to my whiteness. I want to talk to you about my experiences and my perspectives, who I am. I want to talk to you about my leading identity, which is not race or sexual orientation or gender or religion. But at the same time that I want to be this individual and be separated from whiteness and what it entails, I have to force my brain and my mouth to say this. I am capital W white. And I have to accept everything that comes with that comes with whiteness. I need to understand whiteness from a scholarly perspective and understand that whiteness is a location of structural advantage. It is privilege in society because of the notions carried by our society, because of the way that our institutions are set up, our systems exist. All of these things privilege whiteness, and that's something that I need to realize, is that I'm not non-racialized in the way that a lot of white people want to view themselves. I belong to a racial group, and I belong to everything that is carried in that, I am part of racism as an institution. It's really easy to see whiteness as something belonging to racists or belonging to bad white people, but at the same time, the whiteness that defines those people defines me as well, and that's something I think I need to acknowledge, and that all white people need to acknowledge. Disengaging from race, or not talking about it, not thinking critically about it, doesn't help anything. That type of disengagement and ignoring race or ignoring whiteness is the very practice that keeps whiteness what it is in society, keeps whiteness as a place of power and privilege through our institutions and our system. and not talking about race fortifies whiteness against diversity, fortifies it against cooperation. I think that disengaging from racial matters or racial conversations, race relations, does nothing to, foster amicable relations between races. I think that when we engage in these conversations, we can have better understandings of existing power dynamics and, get a sense of what shifts need to occur. We need to understand the racism that is ingrained in our institutions and is ingrained in our society, the fact that whiteness and racism is systemic, it is institutional. And I think when we start to have those conversations, we can acknowledge race, acknowledge, these dynamics, and start making changes that combat existing racial power structures. And I guess this just means that I want to maintain the capacity to think critically about race and engage in conversations about race. Time's getting pretty up there. I guess I'll close it there. Thanks, GRI 201. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Peace.